Turn that off.
Mute it. All right, we're live.
All right.
So, before we get into the topics that we want to talk about, some crazy shit happened this past week. We had a borrower get scammed out of, how much was it? Almost 200 grand?
$200,000, yeah.
So, let's just talk about fraud. Obviously, that's on the rise. We're watching the news with a lot of these banks collapsing, which we can get into, but they're talking about a lot of fraud due to everything in the news. So what happened?
Yeah, so obviously there's always been fraud in real estate. It's ripe for, scam schemes that everybody's running, but we had a client that was closing on a short-term rental property here in Central Florida area. There was sort of a turnkey, rent-ready property, and 2 days prior to closing, he had received an email from the title company, or who he thought was the title company, and apparently it was somebody that was spoofing the title company's email addresses, then was actually corresponding with the borrower for 2 weeks unbeknownst to everybody. This borrower was sort of new to the investing space, and having another seasoned borrower of ours, another client of ours that was helping them out, and even that client was unaware that the actual guarantor was talking to whomever this person was. So he had thought it was the actual title company, and that individual a couple of days prior had told him an amount that needed to be wired for closing, and we weren't even ready with the amount. There wasn't a settlement statement. We were still drafting docs, and I guess he proceeded to send 2 separate wires culminating almost in $200,000 right before closing. So the morning of, we get a phone call that says, hey, client wired money to God knows where. And that's when the Secret Service got involved and the FBI got involved. And obviously, as you know, the circumstances, from what I gathered, I think you had heard that the agent had mentioned that this happened prior with the title company, the same month?
Same month, yep.
Yeah, so I mean, this goes back to like really having to vet your third parties. Like, you got to be careful. And this is, if you don't have title companies that are hyper aware of just fraud and having systems to protect you, things that title companies do, like not accepting wire instructions via email, they make you call to verify them. And for a new investor, they don't know these things. I mean, they just, they think that's a title company and they're antsy to get it closed and they're ready to get their money out. But yeah, this is the second time it happened with that title company, unfortunately.
I would be in massive panic if I thought I lost 200 grand.
Yeah, I mean, his daughter stepped in because he's a bit older and maybe not tech savvy, so she was helping him out in combination with our other client that was who's property managing the short-term rental. From what we gather, luckily the FBI initially it was a domestic wire, so it didn't go overseas to an overseas account, which made it a little bit easier to track. The FBI was able to recover $30,000 or so because it was 2 separate wires initially, and did get all the money back. So good news, he was able to close on the property. We had to get an extension a little bit, and obviously the sellers understood, albeit they weren't happy, but they selected the title company, the buyer didn't, we didn't. So yeah, you just got to be hyper cognizant. So to that point, what can people do to be a bit more, safe with who they're communicating with or anything along? Because I know you've seen fraud. I mean, you can touch on some things. You've been doing this a while that you've seen in the past.
I've seen crazy things. I've seen attorneys pack up shop in the middle of the night with millions of dollars in escrow money and try to make a run for the border. And the whole topic of today is risk mitigation. So there's a couple of things that you can do, but to this borrower's point, I mean, he did a lot of what he was supposed to do. So number one, you said they hacked the email or had a very similar address, which, you might be able to spot that, you might not, especially if your lender, CapSource in this case, is the one communicating on your behalf with the title company. So had we known that he was communicating and who he was communicating with, we could have possibly matched up the
Sure.
addresses and see if there was a difference or not. The main thing is you want to call the title company before wiring funds, which he also did. So not only did the email address almost mirror exactly what the title agent's address was, he spoke to somebody at the title company's office. I guess the last line of defense is to check with your lender to make sure that everything that they're communicating to you is accurate. That's why we're there.
Yeah. And in this case, he had 2 weeks been talking to this individual, and God knows what that looked like over 2 weeks, but he just didn't ask anybody. You know, he had somebody helping him. He didn't bring him in. It was we all got blindsided. The signing was at 10 a.m. Eastern, and we're finding this out at 9 a.m. And again, to your point is you got to really make sure who you're talking to is who you're talking to. Make sure that lender is doing things like encrypting emails, using secure ways to upload files. A common thing within the body of the email telling you to look out for fraud. So for any new investors out there, just double check your numbers, double check who you're talking to, make sure you're super comfortable with what's going on. And if you have any questions, just pick up the phone and call the lender, the individual you're talking to that is legitimate, is authentic. And if they have any questions, they can have their legal team or anybody step in and say, oh, yep, everything's on the up and up. But yeah, I've heard stories over the years from you, obviously. I think there was an NFL player that was impacted on a fraud scheme.
Yep. Had a broker steal a couple $100,000 at closing.
Yeah.
Again, same thing. Wire fraud. One thing that you did do that was really important in that process is you remained calm. You gave him the exact steps on what he should do. Therefore, he remained calm, and nobody was, acting irrationally.
Sure.
And when there's large sums of money, it's, I understand if you are going to act irrational.
Yeah.
But staying calm and making sure that you're communicating properly with all of the right parties. Luckily, the funds went to a major bank, which is well protected. They have good policies in place. Chase, I think, was where the funds ended up. So he was luckily able to get that money back. We had spoke to somebody right after explaining that situation where they had something similar, not as much money, and they never got it back.
Yeah, and it can happen to anybody. It really can, and it goes back to just making sure you're working with competent people that communicate well. I mean, there's a million title companies you can work with. There's a million attorneys that you can close with if you're in an attorney state. So we can tell a story of we had a closing on a file, and it closed with an attorney, I believe in North Carolina possibly, or Georgia, and that attorney accidentally wired us $100,000.
Yep.
We have a Chase accounts. The payoff on the property was a refinance or it was a purchase, either one, that had a payoff, and the payoff account was Chase. And the attorney proceeded to wire us both our fees and the payoff amount.
And was oblivious to it, didn't even catch it.
Yeah.
It was us reaching back out saying, hey, I think there's an extra $100,000 in my account that's not mine. And he went into panic mode.
Yeah. So, I mean, the fact of the matter is there's just an abundance of incompetency and idiocy in real estate. I mean, I throw a rock in any direction in a room full of real estate professionals, and half of them probably shouldn't be there.
Right.
And a lot of them got in during the boom of the market, where everybody can make money in real estate. You can make money as an agent. You didn't even have to know what you were doing because money was so cheap. Everybody needed houses. Everybody could afford the houses because the money was so cheap, especially since 2010 to sort of now, or until the rates changed. So there's just a plethora of people that really aren't qualified to be in this space. We're seeing a thinning of the herd with some of what's going on in the banking industry that's affecting the mortgage industry that's, already in turmoil over the last, 6 months or so because of the rate changes. So you really just have to know who you're working with. Work with a title company that you trust, that, somebody has closed with them before, that you can go to their office, talk to them, look at reviews online, do all the due diligence you possibly can. And you also want to form a good relationship with them. If
Sure.
you're trying to scale, you don't want to be sending all your closings to multiple titles. Now, sellers will dictate who they want to close with sometimes, but at the end of the day, you can always have your attorney review it and just feel protected, or have your attorney hold your money and they wire that money.
So great point. How do you feel? Because I know it's more expensive, but it's a line of defense to what we're talking about right now. And you know, a previous life that we were both in on the lending side, we had our clients always work with our attorney. We told them, hey, I understand it's going to cost you a couple grand extra at closing, but we have extra lines of defense in place in case something like this happens. So how do you feel, and how often is it happening now where we have a title company or attorney representing the seller, and then we have one representing our buyer?
Yeah, I mean, it's really dependent probably upon the deal itself. Sometimes that person can't pay the extra money. You can pay for like a lender review, counsel reviewing it, and just pay a flat $250 or whatever their hourly rate is. If you can ideally do that, great. And on something like this, that might have been more preferential because the purchase price wasn't small. You know, we're talking a $800,000 property. You know, so in that case, it's worth, you know, especially if it's your first time, it's worth paying the extra couple $1,000s to make sure everything is done correctly. And obviously, if something's like a convoluted deal that maybe has a creative financing arm with a seller carryback or something unique like that, then obviously bring in an attorney. Because if you're just going with the title company that, especially if you're buying off-market deals, when, you know, listen, we've wholesale properties, we know a lot of wholesalers, they're not all created equal.
Sure.
And sometimes they might be working with a title company that's doing them favors and not really looking out for your best benefit. And there are certainly wholesalers that, you know, will remain nameless for this moment, but if I was closing with them, my attorney would be reviewing everything.
Right.
So,
and it doesn't hurt to ask the seller, hey, I'm an investor. There's some unique characteristics on this deal that maybe you're not aware of, such as having a repair credit line. Are you okay with me working with a title company that is investor friendly?
sure.
You can always check with your lender for referrals. We're happy to give out title companies that we know are reputable, work with investors, understand the transaction, and more importantly, like I said, have a track record. We know that the issues that happened to this particular borrower, possibly losing 200 grand, are far less likely because we have a track record of X amount of deals, you know, closed with them.
And maybe you incentivize the seller. Maybe you say, okay, I'm happy closing with your title company. Perfectly fine. Well, at the accepted contractual price that we have agreed upon, happy to close with them. I will pay you another $500 more, another $1,000 more if you use my title company. I'll give you the option.
Sure.
Whatever you want to choose. The reason I want to incentivize you is I understand you want to use your title company, but I know mine will protect me and protect you.
Right.
So I've never used this title company. I don't know anything about it, so I will go ahead and trust you on it as a seller. But if you want to make a little bit more money and allow me to feel more comfortable with my offer, I want to go with mine.
And if it's a large sum of money, it's a big transaction, you know, it might be worth it then in that instance to pay the extra couple grand. Surely if you're buying $1 million house, you can afford a couple extra grand at closing to make sure that you're well protected. Because had those funds ended up in the wrong bank, you know, you might be out 200 grand.
And had he wired it 4 or 5 days prior, there could be no tracking that down. Had he gone, to your point, to like an overseas bank.
Yep.
And he didn't tell anybody, just sort of sat in silence and nobody figured out to the day of closing. Very fortunate that the second wire, I think, was a day later. So, you know, it's a lesson learned. It's a hard lesson to learn. Luckily, he got his money back. The FBI stepped in and very quickly got the money back to where we were able to get it closed the following week, almost a Friday to Friday closing. So those things happen. People need to be aware of it and just have somebody in your corner that really knows what they're doing.
The whole topic of today is risk mitigation. So on this specific topic, number one, call the title company before. Don't go off of the contact info in the signature of the email. Google the title company, pull the number from Google, call that number and say, hey, my name's Joe. I'm closing on XYZ property. Who's the agent within your office that's handling this transaction? I want to make sure that I'm confirming the right wiring information. Check with your lender if you have one. We're communicating with title throughout the entire process, so we know who the correct person is, if it's the right title company. What else can they do as far as risk mitigation?
If you're physically there, physically go to the office.
Yep.
And listen, this is real estate, title aside, it's relationship building. So, I mean, anybody that's attending real estate events, you're probably attending events with title companies that are sponsoring those events. Shake their hand, talk to people. Like if you're not doing those things, you're not getting the full benefit of how real estate works. Not to pivot topics, but it's the same thing with people tell us, hey, how do I get off market deals? Do I just get on wholesalers' lists for deals? Yeah, you can get on their list, but do you think you're going to see the best deals on that list? Absolutely not.
Right.
They have a stable of buyers that get sort of first grab at everything. So if you're not talking to them, take them out to dinner, take them out to lunch, and really form a relationship with them. If I have somebody that's closing multiple transactions for me, I want to know their cell phone number. I want to be able
Sure.
to text them personally. So and just take that to the next level where these are people that you're on a first name basis with, and not just somebody that's behind the scenes and you're hoping they're greasing the wheels to make sure the machine gets us to the closing table exactly on the time.
Right. Not only do they have their stable of buyers, but they're cherry picking deals for themselves. So if you want to get a look at a really good deal, butter them up.
Yeah.
Take them out, get to know them.
Who do you think they're going to give more deals to? The hedge fund that constantly buys and has endless pockets?
With
or
no questions asked?
With no questions asked, or you?
Right.
And do you think you're going to open that email on an email blast and go, oh, that looks like a great deal, and you're going to be the first one to reply? You're going to be the first one that gets offered? It just doesn't work like that. This is a relationship business. So if you're not going the extra mile, you're doing yourself a disservice. If you think real estate is a get-rich-quick scheme, it is not. It's not immediate gratification. If you got in within the last 2 years as a wholesaler, investor, or whatever, yeah, you probably thought it was because cost of capital was near 0% to the
Right.
banks, and everything was easy. Prices were climbing. Every deal worked. Burr worked. Everything worked. So, I mean, you're delusional if you think that's going to be how it's going to continue, especially after, like you said, we're talking about risk mitigation because of what's happening in the banking industry. Like, that's not going to continue. We talk to people every day and tell them, Burr is not the same as it was 2 years ago.
Right.
We were at the biggest refi boom ever. So I would stress to people the safest way to interact in this space is meet people, authenticate them, authenticate them through their social media, authenticate them by meeting them at events.
And if anything seems off, if it smells funky, slam on the brakes.
Sure.
Like you're never going to look stupid if you reach out to us and say, hey, John, Mark, is this the right person at the title company? Am I talking to the right person? Should I do this? Like if it smells off, then pump the brakes.
Trust your gut.
Yeah, trust your gut.
I mean, we have the same incentive as them. Like, we don't get compensated unless the loan closes. If your lender's taking an upfront fee, you better run in the other direction, right? Nobody should be paying anything up front unless, there's some lenders that do like an application fee here and there for like new construction or something like that. But generally speaking, you're paying at closing. Everybody should be incentivized to get to the closing table.
Even the application fee, we can sit and debate on that. I mean, if anything, it's an appraisal. And if you're using hard money financing, for example, our space, the AMC can send the link.
The payment link.
The payment
directly,
link. So
yeah.
it doesn't even have to come from the lender. It's coming from the source where you're getting
Exactly.
the report. Other than paying for an appraisal, some might require an inspection, third-party inspection, which is fine. I wouldn't pay a penny up front.
And just to clarify, AMC is appraisal management company.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of these banks go through a third party that then in turn contracts an appraiser to go to the property. So yeah, to your point, like, we don't charge upfront fees to anybody. My job is to get your loan closed. If I haven't underwritten that deal and walked through it in its entirety with you on day one and it doesn't close, that's on me. It's my job to know the underwriting guidelines. It's my job to foresee all the things that we have seen in the course of originating $500 million in loans. So, I am a line of defense. You are a line of defense. So to your point, if something smells off, call the guy that also wants to get compensated when the loan closes and go, is this right?
Right.
There is no stupid question. There's a lot to understand in real estate.
There's a lot of money at stake.
At stake, yeah.
How much balder would you be if you lost $200,000?
I would love it, so I wouldn't have to shave my head anymore. If it just all fucked off, it would be great at this point.
If I lost $200,000, my beard would start falling out.
But yeah, like when I heard that, I feel sick for my clients. I don't
Right.
want anybody, that is somebody's hard-earned money. That is somebody's livelihood. That is his generational wealth for his children. That is maybe the stepping stone to, really building an empire of short-term rentals. And it can be heartbreaking. And unfortunately, there are probably more bad stories than the good stories where that money gets recovered. So, just do your best to really vet everybody you possibly can.
There's
and
scams everywhere. If it
Oh my
involves
God.
good sums of money,
Yeah.
I mean, fake Jordans, fake Louis Vuitton purses, surely in real estate.
Yeah, I mean, listen, everybody gets the call about their warranty on their car, right?
Right.
You know, everybody's scanning. Your phones now say potential scam when somebody's
Right.
calling you. So we live in a world where everybody's trying to get a quick buck, and they're doing it the laziest way. And just be cognizant that you got to be on the lookout. So to carry on to the point of risk mitigation, we're obviously seeing, the banking industry affected this week. We've seen, liquidity issues at some of these banks. We've seen banks in our space, mortgage lenders in our space over the last year that have paused lending at times because the rates changing so quickly, realizing their secondary investor, their Wall Street partner that buys their loans, is running into liquidity issues, and we've seen a thinning of the herd, if you will.
Yep.
Again, we go back to it was the easiest time to make money in real estate, so everybody and their brother became a lender, broker, flipper, landlord, and all of those people that really didn't do it right, didn't map out everything, didn't have good processes and systems in place, they're hurting.
Yep.
They are absolutely hurting. And I think one of the things, not to get too deep in the banking industry, but to things that maybe more apply for investors is risk mitigation needs to occur from every investor as they're assessing a deal. When you're running your numbers, you're like, oh, I'm going to make 40 grand on this flip. I'm going to get a 15, 20% ROI. My cash on cash is going to be this. So what I would encourage them, and what you do as well, is having a plan B. And plan B sometimes is, what if you don't sell it? What if it doesn't sell at your price point?
And we're seeing that a lot now.
Yeah, and to talk about that. I mean,
we have good investors that know what they're doing. They know how to get in and out of projects. They do quality work. The properties are just sitting there right now. The problem is now when they're coming back, there's been such a drastic change in what the rates were when they initially closed versus now that, it's not anybody's fault. A lot of this was unforeseen, but the 30-year DSCR programs that we offer, they just don't work.
no.
So the last podcast we talked about, being able to navigate rough waters, right? Smooth waters don't make for good sailors. And right now, it's not a time where you shouldn't invest. You just need to be smarter with how you're evaluating the deal up front, building in your contingencies on your budgets, on your values, on your holding costs, and then having plan B in place. Are you working the numbers right now and even building in a buffer on the refinance numbers? So if you are closing in a bridge loan and let's say at 10%, and then you're going to refinance it and you're hoping your rate is 7.5. Well, maybe you work the numbers at 8. And if the numbers work at 8, then we're safe. If you're overestimating on your taxes, if you're overestimating on your insurance, every aspect of the deal that involves numbers, right now I would build in a contingency. And if it's borderline, then just work it backwards. How far off do I need to be, or can I be, where the deal still makes sense? So, it's not like they're taking longer than they should. It's not like they're doing poor work. I can see the
finished
photos.
product
It's
looks
beautiful.
great, yeah.
But the last thing you want to do is be forced to refinance and then bring money to the table.
Yeah, I think there's a myriad of reasons why people are stuck. Some people that, to your point, we evaluated with one of our account executives that the client had a property, finished product was about $460,000. Mm-hmm. It was probably one of the higher price point products in its given market.
Yep.
And beautiful rehab, no reason it wouldn't sell. Overpriced because they're a bit delusional of where the market is at. So that investor has to understand the comps that they're comparing it to that are 6 months old are no longer the comps.
Right.
Market conditions changed. Look back 90 days to see what's sold. And then you really have to ask yourself, okay, let's say I'm at 460 and that makes me $100,000 if I sell it at 460. Am I content selling it for its right price point at like 425 and just taking less? That's probably the better approach, right?
Yep, 100%.
And for properties that exceed, a higher value, it becomes ever more difficult to do a debt service coverage ratio loan because that interest rate is high, the taxes are higher,
and the rents haven't caught up.
The rents haven't because the salaries in that market haven't caught up. Like we're in Orlando, we saw a net migration of 320,000 people in Florida alone. And to put that in context, the next state, Texas, was 230,000. Everything else was sub 100,000, basically. So the point being is the job market hasn't catch up to the rent in a market. You have out-of-state people moving here that are working remotely, that are earning, New York City salaries, but are living somewhere else that doesn't require that same level of cost of living, so they can afford it. So to the point is that borrower sometimes has to be brought down to reality to sell that at a more appropriate level, or they have to look at the options of where can I refi it. Maybe I'm bringing money to the refinance because I can't get all my cash out, which can be detrimental to you trying to scale.
Yep.
Or maybe if that doesn't work, I have to look at it as a short-term rental, which can sort of circumvent some of the DSCR guidelines. But being a short-term rental, landlord isn't easy. That's not passive income.
Nope.
That's an active job. So everybody that gets into a deal really needs to be laying out plan A, B, C, and D. And if
100%.
if you're not doing
if you can't
that,
flip it, do the debt service numbers work?
yes.
If you're in the position where the debt service numbers are no longer working, then can you switch the business model? Will you switch the business model to a short-term, mid-term rental? And I don't know if it's the same client, but very similar numbers for somebody up in Charlotte where they went to flip it. Theirs did take a little longer than they anticipated. They had some permitting issues, gorgeous rehab. Debt service numbers just did not work. So we did switch their business model and mindset to a short-term rental. And because of our contacts and affiliation with certain masterminds, we were able to put them in contact with another short-term rental operator in their immediate area to kind of give them some insight, some feedback, things to do, things to avoid. And that's a huge, huge help. A lot of lenders won't take the extra step to help you out with that. So that's, quick plug and advantage of CapSource or working with you or myself or anybody else on staff. But it's not just A and B. It's, do you have a C option? Is there a D plan?
We had a client, one of our account executives had a client that had a framing cost issue where they, tore out a wall, had to figure out how to frame. And to the point is, in that scenario, most banks, just be honest, they're not going to work with you. They want their money back. They may extend your loan, which is going to be expensive. And if you're going that route, you might as well fire sale it because you're just going to bleed more money in a high interest only loan, and you're going to pay an extension cost. Whereas if that's going to cost you $10,000 to get 3 months extension, you might as well drop the purchase price $10,000 and see if you could sell it, right?
Right.
And just skip all of that. So we had a client that was stuck in a mid-construction, and I can go to other clients and say, hey, I got a client here. Would you want to help in and JV this? He can give up an equitable percentage to maybe a general contractor. You can say, I can get that done for cheaper and bail you out. That happens. And mid-construction deals are hard to get financed with banks. They don't want to step in on somebody else's problem.
And right now, other lenders are simply offering extensions. Some of them are even taking the extension options off the table.
Sure.
So if you're getting close to that maturity date and you don't have an extension option or a clear exit, isn't it a huge help to say, hey, you know what, I have somebody that can step in and take this off, or maybe joint venture with you, help you get it to the finish line?
Yeah, absolutely. If somebody that has actual plans, somebody that's not just going, well, we can extend you for 3% of the total loan amount for 3 months. That's not a plan. Here's what that is. That's a Band-Aid, right? If you got a wound on your leg, a Band-Aid's only going to do so much for so long. You need somebody to come in there and actually give you a solution that stops the bleeding.
Yep.
A Band-Aid is only going to hold that for so long. So nobody else is doing that. And the problem with some of these banks, you'd be lucky if they extend you. The ones that owe that money to somebody else, the lender that owes that money to somebody else or has a credit line that they're in turn lending to you, and if that credit facility holder is essentially saying, I want my money back, they can't extend. They don't have the power to do that. They owe this guy, so they're going to get it from you one way or another.
Right.
So just be cognizant of that and work with somebody that has a network of resources. It goes back to us telling everybody to go to your local RIAs, your real estate investor associations. Those are resources that can actually give you pragmatic help, not just, we'll give you an extension. Extension is not a solution to your problem.
I think lenders are going to want to hit reset buttons where they're going to force you to refinance rather than extend.
Exactly.
They're going to reset the note. They're going to get a little extra cash out of
at
it.
a higher interest rate.
At a higher interest rate.
And it's going to kill your profit. If
Yep.
you're already having problems and you're holding that and you're bleeding in a high interest only loan, refinancing into a whole nother interest only loan where you're paying more points, probably 2+ points at a higher interest rate,
Right.
that's not a solution.
Right.
What you're just, and what the best you can do is maybe you're sticking a renter in there. Now you're negatively cash flowing just to try to find a solution. But none of this is actually fixing the systemic issue. It's just fixing the symptom, and it's not a solution. So if your lender's not offering you real solutions, you probably don't have the best lender for you.
No, reach out to somebody else. If it's not us, call as many banks as you can find to
100.
see if there's a different option out there, because the bank's going to do what's best for them.
Exactly. At the end of the day, if they want to take that property back, they're going to take that property back. If their secondary investors saying foreclose, they're going to foreclose.
Right.
Because all these none of these banks are holding 30-year paper. A lot of them have funds that they owe this money to other investors. If you're working with a bank that is offering more private money and they do 6-month terms, you're going to have a problem. I don't do 6-month term loans. I get people in their minds will say, oh, this money's easier to obtain. I'm going to be in and out of this job in 90 days or 60 days. Good luck. Good luck. You cannot control the market. You cannot control the supply of materials to the job site. You can't control what's beyond the walls that you didn't catch when you were doing your inspection.
Right.
So make sure that you're working with the lender, in my opinion, that does 12-month, bridge loans, fix and flip loans, because a 6-month loan firstly will not work with a BRRRR strategy. You have to have 6 months of ownership. So once you get to month 6, you know what you're going to do? You're going to extend with that lender for more money, and that was probably a more expensive lender to begin with because they're a fund lender, a balance sheet lender. So work with somebody for 12 months because that's what you're going to need in the given market. If you're in and out in 90 days, great. But you want the options.
But we also see days on market increasing.
Extending, yeah.
So, making sure that if it is a 6-month loan, that you have really pinpointed not just your rehab duration, but what is today, not what it was 6 months ago, but as it sits today, what is your average days on market?
Yeah, and I would probably even conservatively say, 3 months from now, 6 months from now, that's going to be 5 days longer, 7 days longer, whatever that is. And to your point earlier, as these rates climb, you have less end buyers because less people qualify at that loan amount because interest rates are too high. The debt to income ratio doesn't work anymore. So just be cognizant of all of that. Try not to operate beyond the median home price of your market. Unless you're in a space of short-term rental luxury properties, which I still think are very viable in certain areas of the country. But beyond that, it's a dangerous time to flip if you really aren't doing all of that due diligence.
And one thing that people aren't talking enough about is not just the increase in rates, but the tightening of guidelines. So if your lender, let's say, is forcing you to refinance, are you 100% sure that you're going to qualify with today's specifically credit guidelines? Because 3 months ago, if not less, we could go down to no FICO options.
Yeah, I financed somebody with a 495 credit score last year.
What's the average right now across the board with most banks? 660?
Yeah, 660 minimum. And
so if you close in a bridge loan at 640, and the bank's coming back and saying, hey, you know what, we're not going to extend, you need to refinance, your credit's no longer valid, it's past that 90-day period, and they're going to re-pull it, are you even qualifying?
Yeah, and people are going to go seek these more private money lenders that will still do something, but we both know what they're going to do. They're going to make you pay 3 or 4 points, maybe an exit fee, which is just another point when you exit. They're going to make you pay 15% interest rate, and they're going to do what we refer to as loan to own.
Right.
They're not going to give you max leverage. They're going to give you a leverage to where they're winning at the end of the day. Maybe it's 60% loan to value.
They almost hope you default.
They hope you default. They certainly do. So, it's just for anybody your credit is your reputation. If you don't understand that credit is absolutely important in America, in this society, you're doing yourself a disservice. If you're one of the people that goes, I always pay something cash, well, you'll always be poor. Congratulations.
Right.
That's a sad way to put it, but you're not smart because you have zero debt. You're actually just preventing yourself from growing. Other people's money, OPM, leverage your money. There's a reason why you want to, there's a thing called good liabilities, good debt. If that debt is cash flowing, that's good debt. I mean, get so big that you can't fail because you have so much debt, essentially is the end goal of capitalism.
We know plenty of investors that will basically preach, give me as much debt as you're willing to you're willing to give
as
me.
long as it's underwritten, smart, it's cash flowing, assets that they're acquiring and taking debt out to acquire cash flowing assets. So your credit score is extremely important. And this is something we should probably touch on is it is extremely common. And we feel, I guess, maybe on the other side of the fence of some of these lenders that during the course of the rehab, you're going to use your credit cards, right? Mm-hmm. So if you want to touch on that, of what that issue is creating for some people in a moment.
Well, number one, it keeps the borrower liquid. I'm sure they're earning some type of reward points, whether it be through Home Depot or Lowe's, but there are lenders that use proprietary scoring systems where they're not just looking at the credit score. They are going to do a deeper dive and look at things like credit card utilization. How much are you tapping out those credit lines? So you could literally have 720 credit and have paid off 3 loans with specific lenders. You come back to do the 4th and they say, sorry, I can't offer you financing right now. Why not? The thing that rubs me the wrong way is they won't give a direct answer, but you and I both know what it is 9 out of 10 times, and it's probably credit card utilization.
Most of the time, yeah. The main reasons for denial are age of accounts. Maybe they opened up a new credit card during the course of that. Does that make them more risky? I don't know. But yes, it's extremely common that somebody that is...
But in an industry that's performance-based,
I know.
If I can see that you've successfully acquired, rehab, and exited 4 or 5, however many properties, is it really the score that's that important? Or do you know how to get through the process A to Z with no issues?
You're 100% right, but they can't have that logical conversation with Wall Street. Wall Street wants to just draw a black and white line saying you're here or you're here. I won't touch it if you're on the negative side of that fence.
And that's really where the problem is the institutional investors that have come into the space. It's not, I mean, old school hard money was private money.
Yeah.
It was all privately
True asset-based
raised,
lending.
asset-based, 100%. It was a 6 or 12-month loan. There was no 30-year financing. But because all of this money came into the market, and I don't blame lenders even on the short-term paper side if they're not holding it to sell it off. But now Wall Street controls what we controlled 8, 9, 10 years ago.
Yeah, and listen, I understand not lending to somebody with a sub 600 credit score.
Sure.
Like that speaks to some
They
level
obviously
of,
have an issue with paying their
there's
debt.
something there that is a risk, right? But the individual with a 720 score that carried high credit card utilization because, and we'll explain why, but rehabs are a reimbursement system. So you're not getting 100% of that rehab money at closing. Otherwise, you could walk away and make a profit by just taking the lender's rehab credit line. But it's a reimbursement system, so to get through that system, they need cash to start.
Right.
And quite often, some of them will open up, to your point, maybe a Home Depot card to build up points. And maybe they have an intro APR with that card for a year or two at 0% APR. Well, with our loans or the loans with rehab, we do what's called non-Dutch interest, meaning you do not pay interest on a rehab budget until you use it.
Yep.
But once you use it, you're going to be at a 10, 11, 12% interest rate with today's rates. Instead of using that $25,000 from the lender at 10, 11, 12%, financial literate people are going to go, oh, I'll just use my 0% Home Depot card, pay no interest on it. I will build up additional rewards points. And financially speaking, it's the better path. But when that person goes to get a second loan from that lender, they're going to go, oh, I'm sorry, despite the fact you have a 720 score, you paid off a loan with us, your high credit utilization is a risk.
Do you pay for your airfare with your cash, or do you use
Absolutely
a credit
not.
card to earn points?
Every rich person is going to tell you use your credit card for everything.
Yeah. Well, the other thing is if you're an investor, you're always on the hunt for the next deal.
Sure.
So if I just put 30, 40 grand down on this property that I intend to flip, I'm going to utilize my credit card to start the rehab or do a big chunk of the rehab. That way, when that great deal comes across my desk, when I'm only 50% of the way through on this project, I don't have to pass on it.
100%. They're more liquid, to your point, to where they're flexible to not miss on the next deal as they're in the midst of their current deal. And that's something we preach. Obviously, I'm a believer is the more liquid that individual is, the more likely they're going to be able to make their payments. So I have no problem with somebody running up their credit card, then at the end of the loan, taking the proceeds of the loan and paying everything off. Obviously doing it in an intelligent way, but it is advantageous at times for them to do that. I mean, there are people that open up credit cards specifically to get 0% APRs every year, and they have basically a credit card game they run. But it works. They're using the right system, so it can be frustrating. But to your point is everybody has to protect their credit. If your intention is to go to debt service coverage ratio loans, long-term financing, there is no wiggle room on credit. Wall Street is not going to buy that note from that lender if, on an exception because this guy's got a 580 credit score.
And with everything that's gone on the last 6 months, they're not going to risk it. Whereas maybe a year ago, they might make the exception if you're a point or two off. They're not going to risk not being able to resell that note.
I mean, that's what we're seeing happen to, or partially what's happening to the Silicon Valley Bank is those things of having bad notes they're holding, bad assets. Now, a lot of those are, when we dug into it, are lower loan to value and they can take them to market, but they're holding them. And yeah, you can lose money that way. This is, we're back in the space of if somebody was doing some non-QM, which is just as rebranded some prime mortgages, like, they could be underwater very quickly in a shift in the market. So you as an actual borrower or investor have to mitigate against that. Be aware of that. Protect your credit. Be as safe as you can. Freeze your credit when you're not using it.
Yep.
For anybody that has kids, I would tell you to freeze your children's credit, their socials and everything, so people can't open up credit in their name. There's a myriad of ways to get your credit up, but just be cognizant of that because your credit is your reputation.
At CapSource, we're not using that proprietary scoring system, but I guess what makes us unique is that we always price match our product with any other products out there, any other correspondent lines that we might be using. So tying it into mitigation, risk mitigation, we're having that conversation up front. When we're looking at all three options, hey, if we go with option B, for example, let's talk about where your credit card utilization is. Can we pay a little bit of that down? So that we're giving them the best chance to not just get the financing, but get the financing with the best rate, maybe the lowest points, the highest leverage, whatever that may be, if it's not something that we're able to offer directly.
Yeah, and I would say, just to give people a little context, credit in our space is looked at in brackets of almost 20 points. So like we mentioned, 660 being the minimum, the next threshold would be 680. So anything between 660 to 679 is a certain flat base rate, interest rate. As you get to 680, it changes to 700 to 720, up to about 760 and above. So be aware of that. If you're on the cusp of, like, let's say 719 to 720, that could be a drastic difference. That could be a leverage difference, meaning you get a higher amount of money back. It could be a drastic interest rate drop that could be a 0.5% difference.
Which could affect your debt service ratio.
Yeah, so even just using, and it's not always wholly accurate, but any credit services your banks provide, or Credit Karma, or looking at your free annual creditreport.com, getting your credit report, and understanding, okay, I'm ready to do this loan, and maybe I'm a couple points away. To your point, can I pay something off, wait till that updates next month, and now I'm at such a significant break that is going to allow me to have a better cash flowing asset for the next 30 years.
So before we get back into more risk mitigation, let's speculate just for a second, because we talked about interest rate hikes. We're briefly touching on what's going on with a lot of the smaller banks out there. So we've seen the fall of Silicon Valley Bank, Signature. There's a couple others, I believe.
Silvergate, I think, was one.
And we've been paying attention to the news, and it's almost split depending on who you're listening to or what you're watching on what the Fed's going to do next week. We've heard possible decreases. We've heard them possibly pausing. We've heard 0.25% hike. A week ago, it was 0.5%. What do you think is going to happen next week?
I think they injected liquidity into some of these banks. The other banks basically gave these a bailout to some degree, bought some of the assets, bad assets. I'm not, the expert on this, and I'm not here to pretend to be. I think we'll still see 0.25%. I think we need to see 0.25%. At the end of the day, just because this occurs doesn't mean we can't try to do the things that are here to prevent inflation. It is a real issue. And if we then just keep everything flat, we're just we're not facing the problem, the systemic problem. So I think it's 0.25%. I don't know. I don't think anybody has a crystal ball. To your point, you've seen 50 different people get on TV and say different things. So we'll inevitably see, but at some point we got to get things under control. And it's unfortunate. I mean, we're in a country where the middle class foots the bill for everything. Big banks get bailed out.
We saw the 2-year Treasury note drop massively on Monday, gained a little bit back on Tuesday, and then dropped again Wednesday.
Yeah, I can get a 3-month Treasury bill for like 5% return. So it's like if I'm going to park my money somewhere, because one of the biggest rules of money is don't just have money sitting there. You're losing money to inflation if it's not earning your money. So even parking it in a 3-month Treasury bill, not here to give investment advice, but it's smarter than just sticking it into a savings account that makes you maybe a 0.25% back. And really you're losing money because all that bank is doing is taking your money and lending it out, and they're going to make money.
Right.
So you might as well put your money to work. So if you're somebody that has money in the bank, I would encourage you to try to deploy it. We work with capital, private capital that people want to deploy, whether they want to put it into our deals or deals for our clients. That's something we do. Whether they want to raise, if they're an accredited investor and they want to put it into funds, we can connect them to people to do that.
Put it to work.
Yeah, put it to work. If you're sitting on money, you're losing money. Scared money doesn't make none. But it's absolutely true, and it's one of the laws of money. Like you just can't be sitting on piles of cash, otherwise your bank is making all the money off your money.
Yep, 100%. Not that anything that's going on in the banking world is necessarily good news, but a 0.25% hike is a lot better than 0.5%, and we'll see what happens. But from a lot of the speculation that we're watching, after that, when they meet again in June, maybe we see our first drop.
Potentially, again, it's all going to be predicated on like the CPI, the seeing job market and all of that stuff. They'll track it every month. There'll be a new conversation of every month of what somebody should do. And once the waters settle with what's going on in the banking industry a bit, if they do settle, some of these banks, in my mind should fail, but the systemic sort of ripple of all that would be so detrimental to people that, again, you go back to you're kind of too big to fail.
Right.
And that's scary. It's unfortunate. I get it's not a fair system. Well, life's not fair. Capitalism isn't fair. But you have to really protect yourself because nobody else is going to protect you.
Yep.
And if you're not doing all the right things, whether it's like looking out for fraud like we discussed or underwriting deals to where you have plan B, C, and D, and really extending your network of capital. If you work with a bank and you're like, that bank has always been great. They rubber stamp my files, never been easier. You're just complacent. You're going to run into an issue. Like, there are banks out here. I just heard from yesterday from a well-seasoned broker that we talked with a bank we've worked with in the past that had to liquidate a large portion of their portfolio to, refill their coffers.
Yep.
So, I mean, that's going to happen. And if you think I have a single source for lending, you're going to run into issues. I mean, there's not a single bank out there that can do every deal. Real estate is different.
Diversify your money, diversify your portfolio, which is also a great buffer for
Sure.
risk. The other thing that's been in the news is, what could potentially happen with specifically in commercial office space, how that could be, drastically detrimental to investors that are investing in that specific asset class, where we know people investing in self-storage, which is a little bit more recession-proof. But diversifying your portfolio, making sure that your money's spread out into multiple assets, different types of avenues of investing is important. Don't put it all in one place.
Yeah, and to your point, when you say recession-proof, there are 4 sort of recession-proof or viewed as recession-proof assets. One being storage facilities, multifamily, RV parks, then industrial.
Industrial, yep.
So, industrial is very big right now. It's hard to acquire. There's a lot of e-commerce going on, a lot of people needing that space. To your point of storage facilities, which we have clients that do storage facilities that, no tenants, no toilets. In the midst of good times, people buy a lot of stuff, fill up the storage facilities. In the midst of bad times, they might have to downsize their apartment. They don't want to lose that sentimental stuff. They put it in storage facilities.
Yep.
So it is recession-proof. RV parks being, large cash cows that, low-income housing, those sort of mobile home parks. They're not going to appreciate the same, but nonetheless, they're going to be cash cows in any market. So those things make sense to put your money into, and practically not everybody can do that, but you can do it through means of investing with other people, syndication deals or funds. Yes, you may not have the means to go out and buy yourself your own storage facility, but you can do it by partnering with people. So there's a myriad of things to diversify your portfolio. Maybe you have 20% short-term rentals, 30% long-term tenant rentals, 30% are active flips, and the rest are whatever asset class you choose. But I would be diversifying as much as possible, because if all your eggs are in the same basket, same market, same neighborhood, same asset type, you are just so much more.
You're at a high
risk.
Yeah.
I mean, here in Florida, if everything was in Fort Myers, look at the hurricane, and now
Yep.
it's gone. Fort Myers was arguably the hottest market in the country. So, while you're sitting there going, "Oh, I have all my assets in the hottest market in the country," well, Mother Nature said, "Good
No,
luck
thank
with it."
you.
You didn't
I'll take
foresee
that.
that, and obviously that's Florida specific, but that can happen anywhere. I mean, what happens if you had homes in Ohio in East Palestine when the train derails? That's something you cannot anticipate. That's, again, could happen anywhere, anytime. And if you're not really moving into other assets and constantly learning in real estate and learning about other assets, you're just doing yourself a disservice.
Yep, 100%. So our bread and butter is single family, multifamily, 2 to 4.
Yep.
We'll do some commercial, we'll do self-storage, we'll do some mixed unit, we'll do some apartment buildings, but single family, multifamily, 2 to 4. So mitigating risk on those assets. We can go through a couple of the main topics for risk mitigation. If you want to add any, feel free, but the top 3 may be condition, location, and then I threw in zoning regulations.
Sure.
I think you were talking about an example. I don't know if it was on a Zoom call, but somebody was asking, is it a good investment to buy my single-family house across the street from an industrial property? So we'll go back in order, though. So starting with condition, especially right now in this current market, one way to mitigate risk is don't take on these massive projects. Anytime your rehab's exceeding your purchase price, it's a risk to the lender. At least that's how we look at it. But these projects where you're basically ripping it down to the studs right now, where you know that the time frame or the duration of that project's going to go a lot longer, and I know people don't build in enough time for those types of larger rehab projects. So talking about condition, what would you focus on right now to mitigate risk in this current climate?
I would focus on what the hedge funds are focusing on,
which is basically deferred maintenance. Those are going to have slimmer margins, but I think investors need to have get rid of the mindset that I need to hit a home run on every flip.
Yeah, it needs a single's good. A single can win you the World Series, right? Mm-hmm. If you've already set up every other pillar and the bases are loaded, you don't need to hit a grand slam. So hit a single. You'll get there. And if you hit a single after a single or a double, you'll eventually find the good deals. You get the large spreads. And right now, we're in an uncertain market, so I take what I can get that makes sense. And it's not like I'm saying you're going to be able to find perfectly deferred maintenance, cosmetic, lipstick flips all over the place.
Right.
So it's not to say don't open up the box and look at moderate flips, but what does moderate mean? Does moderate mean I have to repair a pool? No, thank you. Mm-hmm. Does moderate mean I'm just maybe moving a load-bearing wall to open up a space and maybe I have to render the bathrooms fully? That's okay. But it is very risky if you are, number one, tackling the most distressed property in the entire neighborhood that really is to the studs. It's risky if you're stepping into a deal that somebody else is liquidating, that they were going to rehab it, and now you're stepping in saying, "Oh, I can get it done."
Right.
That's a common one where people send us deals, and I'm like, "It's already to the studs. I can tell there's flooring in there. Somebody was in the midst of a rehab, and now they're selling it. Why?" You should be asking.
That's stuff that we can look up behind the scenes that investors maybe aren't doing, especially if you're newer and you don't have access, aren't paying for tools like maybe Batch Leads or PropStream, where we could look it up and say that was clearly an investor.
Yeah.
And why are they walking away from it mid-project? You don't want to take on somebody else's problems. So large dollar amounts. The median home price right now in Orlando is what?
I don't know. So I would say mid
But if you had to guess,
350.
Our
or
average
so.
loan amount is right around 260, 270.
Yeah.
Okay, so I would probably avoid those 6-figure rehab budgets. I mean,
Yeah,
that's-
unless you're a luxury flipper and this is your
And
business.
it's not to say
and-
that there aren't investors that can't handle those projects right now. We know a couple of them that we're doing loans for that are able to take on those big projects. But we're talking to the masses. A lot of people that we're talking to are newer investors, maybe 5 projects or less, and they're navigating rough waters right now.
Yeah.
It goes back to the point that we made earlier, and again on the last podcast. It's almost good that if you're a new investor, you're dealing with this problem right now.
Adversity is good.
Yeah.
It
I
is.
mean, you know, pressure makes diamonds.
Yeah, this will happen if you are an investor through the course of multiple short-term debt cycles. There is a bottom to the cycle.
Yeah.
It's not always riding the wave up and being at the crest of the wave. Like there is the trough of the cycle that is going to thin the herd. It's going to take the people out that haven't taken the extra step of putting the systems in place, the processes in place, really dialing their numbers in.
Mm-hmm.
Business is math. Understand the math of business. Because if you don't, you're going to be in trouble. You're going to be the first one that's calling us going, bail me out.
Right.
And ideally, we have a solution for you, but not every time we do. You know, sometimes you are just underwater and you have to accept that you take the loss, learn from it, and move on.
So on condition, if you can pick up the deferred maintenance projects, staying within that scope of work that the hedge funds will look at, which is typically properties built after 1980, 4.2s, 3.2s, 1,000 square feet, very cookie cutter, hopefully in established subdivisions and neighborhoods. Those are typically going to be upkept better than maybe a property that's on a couple of acres out in the boonies. The other thing with condition, anything else that you would add?
You know, not specifically. I mean, you could get really, you know, in the
One thing
weeds.
I would add is when you're calculating that budget, do it with your contractor.
Oh yeah.
I mean, too often people are coming up with these numbers on a whim, looking at photos on Zillow, and then they walk through it with their contractor. Sometimes after we've started the process, which drives me insane, and it comes back $20, $30, $40, $50,000 higher than what they were initially estimating.
If you are relying upon a rehab calculator you found online, I don't care who online offers it to you, you're doing it wrong.
Right.
If you are relying on a general contractor that is literally not itemizing everything, I mean, really itemizing everything. I don't mean he's saying, oh, the kitchen's 10 grand. I would say, no, you come back to me with a quote where you're laying out what 10 grand means.
Specifically, what types of materials are you using? What type of countertops are we putting in there? Are we doing stainless steel appliances? Are we doing scratch and dent? Those little, you know, things add up at the end of the...
Yeah, an estimation on square footage is a joke. It is a joke. It is, and I would also, like, if you're not really digging into the itemized, and I heard this a long time ago from a really seasoned contractor at an event I was at, and if you're not itemizing those things specifically, how can you argue to, or even review where you should be pinching pennies if something
Comes up mid-project.
mid-project? And you know, luckily with our loans, you get 4 change orders. You can reallocate money. So, and we build in contingencies, but
How much of a contingency are you building in? Is
So-
it 5%?
yeah, it's predicated on really the purchase, the rehab budget to purchase price. To your point of that too, if your rehab budget exceeds your purchase price, it's probably going to get denied with most lenders, right? Now, I understand some markets that's just what it is. You know, you could be buying in Detroit for $2 grand, putting 100 into it.
Indianapolis is a great
Yeah,
example of that.
and that happens. I get it, but it is going to be difficult. But yes, we build in 5% or 10%, depending on what the ratio from rehab is to purchase price. If the rehab is exceeding 50% of the purchase price, or there's anything foundational, structural into there, we're probably going to do 10%. If it's just cosmetic, it'll probably be 5%. So really dial those numbers in. To your point, walk through your general contractor. If they're coming back with the most rudimentary quote, say, nope, I don't accept this, or don't work with that contractor.
Right.
Because when you need to argue with them about why am I paying this, and you can't go through the itemized sheet, what are you going to argue off of?
Right.
Some just ballpark number that could encompass so much that you don't understand. So really don't do things rudimentary. Understand that your rehab calculator you're finding on, you know, whatever site it is just that. It's the simplest form of calculation. It is maybe just a starting point. And the really successful people, especially as if you're doing multiple projects, ideally you're replicating the same project. I'm
Right.
using the same flooring. I'm using the same countertop. I'm using the same cabinets, and I'm buying in bulk and negotiating better prices because I'm buying in bulk.
And I guess the only other thing I would add on condition is making sure that you're not over improving for the area. And we have a very specific example again that we can talk about where the investor went probably 25, 30K over the initial budget to make it pop. And the way that he made it pop did not match anything else in the immediate area. It did not match that neighborhood. So he over improved and is now going to have the most expensive house in the neighborhood. And I don't ever want to have the most expensive house or the most expensive listing in a neighborhood.
Well, and to that point is also, what are you over improving? Are you adding high-end flooring that is not yielding back any value? If you're improving the master bathroom, that might be a wow fact. I can understand something like that, but if it's just flooring, I guarantee it's not going to make a 20, 30 grand difference if it's travertine or LVP. You know, it might in some markets, but not in most, right?
Yeah, the floor looks like it belongs in a Scarface.
Scarface,
movie.
yeah, that's exactly what. It's a Miami. You know, you could do lines of cocaine off and be perfectly fine. But the point being is, people do that. They get into these projects and they go shopping as if they're shopping for their forever home.
Right.
This is a business. It is a business.
And it's problematic because it's not going to sell. And now the numbers, the work that we did up front for your plan B to make sure that you can refinance it and get that 30-year debt, make sure that it qualifies on the DSCR ratio, doesn't work now.
No, it does not at all.
So because you wanted it to look a certain way, you've priced yourself out in terms of, you know, what the neighborhood's calling for, and you've made my job infinitely more difficult because I'm not going to let you fail. So now I really need to kind of put pen to paper to figure out how are we going to make this work? Or are you going to have to just take a haircut and you know, come to terms with the fact that you're not going to get what you're asking for, and I'm going to have to come back and say, nope, we need to cut this by 30, 40 grand.
Yeah, and people have a tendency to do it, and that's, we're the first line of defense, hopefully, for some people. To say, I had a client that had a smaller property, like 800, 900 square feet, and the rehab budget was like $80,000, and you know, we got the deal done. It still made sense, but it concerns me if I was personally doing it, because I don't want to be tackling rewiring a whole house and replumbing and doing all the major components. To your point of what else to look for on maintenance, you know, we have the 4-point inspection like you have in Florida, 4 points being roof, electrical, plumbing, and HVAC. You should be looking at those things immediately. Those are the big, you know, ticket items,
Yep.
the ones that you can easily sort of price out and say, okay, this is, you know, architectural shingles are X amount of this area, and, you know, HVAC is running this at the moment. Those are things that are easier than trying to get into the counting every nails and hammers you're buying. But yeah, look for those, and if those are solid, that's a good foundation. Saying, okay, I won't have to touch any of the really scary stuff that can delay stuff.
Yeah.
You know, if you have a septic, get a septic inspection. If you have a well, get that well inspected. You know, those things could be extremely detrimental to your budget and will disallow you from selling on the back end to somebody that wants to use a government loan, because the government's going to say, oh, that roof has less than 2 years of use life. We can't lend on it.
And so don't over improve, but also don't underestimate because you think that that's what we want to hear.
Don't be conservative.
Exactly. Yeah. So I can look at a project and say, okay, this is going to take every bit of 70 grand to get done. But they think that that might be an issue with us. So they're going to come back and say, John, I can get this done for 30, 35 grand. I had this happen with a pretty high level investor where they were saying it's going to cost 30 grand to fix this property. I knew in every way, shape, or form that it was going to cost every bit of 70 grand. But because of their track record, I trusted them and made it very clear that, hey, when we close on this, if it is 70 grand, that
There's
40
no
grand
more money.
difference is coming out of your pocket. I can't restructure the loan. Not even 3 weeks into that project, get a call, hey, John, you were right. What can I do? Nothing. You need to come out of pocket. You need to pull in a private investor. You now need to joint venture with somebody else to get that property to the finish line. I can't help you.
Or you hope somebody can refinance you, and most lenders don't want to step in on a mid-construction refinance.
Yeah.
They're going to go, why? You just finance this. Why are you doing it?
Exactly.
And you're going to tell them, and they go, absolutely not. If you're not competent enough to set that from the beginning, we're not going to step in and bail you out. So 100% happens all the time where people sometimes don't take our advice. And listen, we're not out the job site. So I'm not here to tell you exactly what the rehab budget is. That's not my job. But
Right.
I am here to tell you, I think you're wrong.
Right.
I think this doesn't seem right. It's not adding up. And some people do own construction companies that, know they can get materials cheaper, that have the capability, and we have investors that do that. But at the end of the day, the bank is going to want to set that rehab budget as to what they can complete the work for, because if you default, they don't have the benefit of your crews, your way to source materials, your free labor that you're finishing the flooring yourself.
Well, they're not picking it up the next day.
Exactly.
Like there's a time period between foreclosing and the lender saying, okay, I am going to finish this project out, if they're not just going to immediately, put it back out for their investors to pick up. So, yeah, I think a big one right now is condition, focusing on what the condition is, how much does it need, making sure you're allocating the appropriate amount of funds, and get that number from your contractor. If you're using a contractor, don't eyeball it and come up with a nice round number. Don't compare yourself to an investor buddy that's at your local RIA that does, a dozen flips a year. Get it from the horse's mouth.
And when we talk about contractors, I think for new investors, it's really important that they are getting multiple bids.
Yes.
Get a sense of what everybody's willing to offer, and maybe you subcontract certain things out that are not difficult to subcontract. Maybe you project manage. Maybe it's a really truly light cosmetic, and they're, you don't need a contractor for something if you're just changing carpet and paint. But really get multiple bids, especially as you're starting out. Get referrals, make sure they're licensed and bonded, and ask them to show you a project they've done.
Know how to pay them. When
to
pay them.
When to pay them. Understand lien waivers.
Exactly.
If you don't know what a lien waiver is, a general contractor could take your money, claim you never paid them, and if you have no receipt or way to show you paid them, they can attach a mechanic's lien to your property and say, oh, I'm now in first position because you owe me money on work I did to the property. The bank's not going to be happy about that.
Or if it's mid construction, you're not going to get your next draw.
No, you're going to be stuck until that is taken care of. And for draws, most of these banks, for you to access that rehab money, they want to see the receipts you sent them. They're going to send an inspector out there to verify the work has been completed. They're going to want to see lien waivers, and lien waivers do not just have to be executed when all of the work's done. That's a final lien waiver. But you can do lien waivers, progressive lien waivers, where you sign with your contractor saying, you agree that I've compensated you X amount of money for X, Y work, and we're signing off on this, and then you don't have to worry about that portion being attached to your property as them claiming, oh, I didn't get paid. And let's be honest, contractors, sort of like some wholesalers, aren't the most ethical people out there. We've heard horror stories. I know you had a client that had an electrical contractor, pull a gun on a young woman at one time. That it's just crazy. It's a crazy world.
Walking off, mid-project, disappearing with money.
Stealing materials.
Anything that you can think of, it's happened. So all great points. And if anybody ever wants to get farther in depth on what to do in terms of condition or dealing with contractors or the whole rehab process, obviously something that's offered in coaching. So
yeah, anybody, we do free consultations, we have paid coaching programs, we have paid, hour, 2 hour long Zoom meetings. So, take that time.
And it's worth it. It takes a lot of our time, which is why there's a cost associated, but we're willing to do it because we're true partners. We're not just a lender, we're a partner. We're invested in you, in your business. We want to see you succeed. We want to see you come back. We want to do multiple deals together. So we will take as much time as it needs to get as far deep into the weeds as we need to get to make sure that you're successful. So condition, what about location? And location, you can find good deals everywhere.
Yeah.
But if you're going to focus, are you focusing on metro areas? Are you focusing on where there's growth opportunity? Are you focusing on upward transitional neighborhoods for your rentals, seeing where the forced appreciation is coming from? Can I see where these boundary lines are moving, and maybe this C neighborhood in the next 2 years is going to be an A or B neighborhood? So, there's multiple ways to make money in real estate, and I think from a portfolio perspective, a lot of people are focused on cash flow, but there's very specific targeting that you can do to make sure that you're capturing appreciation as well. Are you coaching any of your clients to look at certain data points? Maybe they're looking at ATTOM data on where the best cash flow spreads are, what counties and cities are those in. So what about location? And we can just break it down into fix and flips and rentals.
Yeah, I think it goes back to why when we talk to people, we really want to get an idea of what their overarching goal is. Like, what is your 1 year, 3 year, 5 year goal? Because that's going to dictate some of that. I would say that just in general, the things I'm looking for, I mean, housing demand in an area, like rental demand, rental rates. If I'm a landlord, if you're doing short-term rentals, you can look at sites like STR Insights. Give you the idea of insights.
On the short-term rentals, I had wrote a couple of them down. STR Insights, Price Labs, AirDNA are a couple of them.
Yeah, and cross-reference them and kind of get your own data there. If you're doing fix and flips, again, it goes back to understanding the median home price of your market. You don't want to be, having your ARV much higher than that because you're limiting your buyer's pool.
Well, let's just touch on that real quick. When you're comping for values, if we're talking to new investors, so I think a lot of people rely on Zillow. I think Zillow has limited data. We use sites like PropStream, Batch Leads. Would you recommend, because you and I are looking at a pretty large portfolio right now in North Carolina for us personally, and there are major discrepancies between Zillow, Batch Leads, PropStream on what these values are. So what would you advise somebody if they're going to focus on location and they're looking at comps and values? Is there a certain algorithm or method that you're using to coach your investors right now?
To be safe, first of all, you can pull, you can look what investors are paying, right? You can pull cash buyers and see what that's a lot how wholesalers dictate how they're going to sell a property, is looking what do the other buyers in this market pay, right? They're not comping anymore on Zillow. The savvy ones are going, what did 123 Main Street LLC that bought 10 other properties surrounding the one I have, what did they pay? And that's how they're comping it. So, if you could do that, that's great. I would be conservative to a degree. Obviously, use MLS. If you have MLS access or have an agent, an investor-friendly agent, I always say that because it's more important. I want my agent to be an investor or my broker to be an investor. Having them do a CMA, a comparative market analysis, or a BPO, a broker price opinion if they're a broker. And you kind of got to dig in. You and I have the, obviously experience of we've seen 1,000 appraisals. Most people never see an appraisal, or they'll see it on the properties they buy. They don't know it. They don't dig into it. They don't read the notes. But the smallest things can affect really values. You might be comping against a property next door where that seller sold it for higher, but they had 20 grand of seller concessions, so it really didn't sell for 350. It sold for 330. So unless you know those things, all of that numbers can be difficult. So err on the side of being conservative. Maybe
if you're on a major street, don't comp it with the property that's in an established neighborhood.
The one that's off a quiet side road
Right.
is not the same you on a busy road. Very smart investors will tell you they'll shave 10% off their value if it's on a busy road. If it's next to an industrial or commercial property, there is no benefit to being next to a 7-Eleven
Right.
or being next to the tire shop. That is
Right.
going to hurt you. Lenders a lot of times don't want to touch those because they're going to do the Google Street View, turn around and go, oh, it's right across from Circle K. No, thank you.
Yep.
So those things, you got to be cognizant of all of that. It can be a lot to learn, but it's a learning process. And if you're not sure, sit down with us. Let us teach you and coach you how to understand comping and how to analyze a deal. I tend, and you probably do as well, tend to underwrite not based on what I think I can quote unquote sell it for, but what it's actually going to appraise for. Because at the end of the day, your loan structure is based on an actual appraisal. So using all of those systems and just saying what seems to be similar, what comps seem to be the best comps. So, is it, here's a good one to point out is, this is very common. When I ask people, send me what comps you're using to get to your after repaired value, they're sending me comps of properties that have more bedrooms. So number one, your appraisers are going to want to go off the same bedroom. Bath, less so. They'll make adjustments for bath, but they want to try to same bedroom. The one that gets me is when the square footage is vastly different. So I'll make 2 points. Number one is your comps should not be outside of, ideally, 5% variance from your square footage. At worst, 10%. So if you have 1,000 square foot property you're looking at buying, you should not be comping against anything that's above like 1,100 square feet in a perfect world.
Right.
So, because those aren't really comps when you start going, oh, I'm comparing my 1,001 to a 1,600 square foot. They're not the same. And it's not a perfect math of just saying, oh, we'll just adjust for the other 600 square feet. It's not the same. I mean, a 2-bedroom might be more desirable than a 3-bedroom in certain markets.
Yep.
So you really have to have somebody in your corner that knows what they're doing until you understand what you should be doing.
Well, even the ones that quote unquote know what they're doing still cross-reference the information that you're getting. I mean, how often have you looked at wholesale deals that have been sent out, looked at Zillow, the square footage is different. You go to the county records, the square footage is different.
That's a great point.
So, making sure that you're doing the proper due diligence so that when you are comping it, you're comping it off of the right number.
Speak on the county records. I think that's one that nobody does. I mean,
which ties into the next, point, which is zoning regulations. Because I just had one where an investor picked up a property, converted the garage. It's operating now as a multi-unit. It's not zoned for multi-unit. The appraiser's having issues comping it out because it doesn't match anything in the area. So. Yeah, not to cut you off, but zoning kind of ties into that as well. Look at the property card and see what you're allowed to do for that area. Where is that property zoned? What can you do? What can't you do?
What's its land class? What's it zoned as? Because an appraiser is going to appraise based on its best use case, right? I mean, to your point is, understand that basements under a below grade level is
not counted.
It's not counted the same. It's counted as a finished or unfinished basement,
right,
and has its own adjustments in the given market. It is not the same as the square footage above ground, right? So people don't understand that. They're not opening their property card. Here's another thing. We see a lot of deals. In my head immediately I can go, oh, there was an extension done to this property. They converted the garage. And in my head, I'm going to look at the property card and go, was that permitted? Is that now part of the overall gross living area, the heated area? And a lot of times it isn't. So these people are comping saying, oh, my property's 1,600 square feet. I say, no, it's 1,300 with a converted garage that wasn't permitted, that will have to be permitted. For when you go to sell it on the back end, if you don't get that handled with the county, you're going to have an issue if that person's using an FHA loan or something along those lines.
And what happens? That sits there longer. You have more holding costs. That's eating into your profit margin, which is doing the opposite of mitigating your risk.
Yeah, and we could give a million examples. Like you have people that come to us that have one parcel, so meaning one zoned lot essentially, and they have two detached, so two separate, what most people would consider a normal single family structure, and you go, okay, that's going to be comped as if two single families are on one lot. It absolutely will not. That's a duplex, right? Unless one of those is a duplex and the other one's a single family, that's actually a triplex now. So we just had one where the client had a, quote, quad, but it was two properties. Those two properties were, for all intents purposes, a duplex, but they had an adjoining door that wasn't closed off, which, because that door could be opened, actually made it only 2 units instead of 4, meaning it's a duplex. So those are very complicated things that most people, if they're not within the financing world or seeing appraisals every day or an appraiser themselves, aren't aware of that.
Right.
So if you don't have somebody in your corner that is aware of that, I can guarantee you're going to run into issues, whether it's on acquiring the loan, and if you don't get it on the front end, you're going to have a problem on the back end when you go to sell it.
Which is a great point, because that, I know which file you're talking about, and that wasn't noted from the client until we actually got the appraisal and the inspection back. And you and I both know that property's not going to appraise.
No.
He's into it for a lot of money. I don't think he's going to be able to refinance. I guess we'll wait and see. So a perfect example of making sure that you mitigate risk by looking at factors like the property card and what the area calls for and doesn't call for. He very well may be stuck.
Yeah, I think looking at the property card is one of the simplest things. And if for anybody needs to know how to do that, Zillow will actually link to it below the tax section. There's a sale price section, then tax section. They will link to the county website. It'll be hyperlinked. And if that hyperlink doesn't work, just type in your county and say county property appraiser, property search. It's going to be 1 or 2 of the top Google searches that comes up. Put in your property address. Look at all that information, and if the county has a wrong sketch of your property, or get an appraisal, get a sketch to the county, reach out to the county and say, how can I have this updated? Can Can I have it inspected? Can I have it proper? Because again, when you go to sell it, you want to get top dollar, and you want the county to reflect exactly what you're advertising the property to be.
Right, and the goal is to get in and out. Don't waste any more time than you have to, because all of that's ultimately coming out of your pocket at the end of the day.
And that's what we try to do here, is be proactive. I mean, a lot of lenders are reactionary. They just say, here's your rates and terms, send these documents. And when it gets to underwriting, true underwriting, 2 weeks into the process, all of this comes to light.
Right.
Not with CapSource. I'm here to figure that out from day one.
Right.
I'm going to look at the property card before it gets started. Our staff is going to look at the property card and get started. And if they haven't, we're not going to start that long.
But going back to the example that you gave, make sure that you're giving us all of the details.
Details.
Like the joining rooms in the middle, that's a big detail.
Yeah.
That was a big thing to leave out when talking about it. So now we're finding out after the fact, and all of the math is incorrect. And really, this business boils down to just simple, basic math.
It's not overly complicated.
No.
Yeah, there's a lot of jargon and learning, and you'll never know everything. But the second you start thinking you do is the second you're going to lose your shirt.
Right.
You know, you're going to have an issue, and people, some of these things are unforeseen. I mean, those are little things that maybe an appraiser won't even come across in their career as an appraiser. So it can be tricky, but rely on your lender. The lender has so much experience. You know, we haven't done the most investment properties of people out there, but I can guarantee you I've seen more than most people will see in a lifetime.
Right.
And I've seen them across multiple markets, and we've seen everything under the sun.
The good and the bad. You have investors that have had, nothing but successful projects. But we've seen the good, we've seen the bad. So to your point, making sure that you're crossing T's and dotting I's, and then allowing us to be your second line of defense.
Yeah, and to put a bow on your point of condition and just, make sure you're just anything major, cracks, foundation, try to avoid those things in the current market unless you're really well versed in that. And to the location, again.
Real quick on location, because I've seen this a lot. Again, we're in a lot of forums, we're communicating with people on a daily basis, and I see a lot of newer investors specifically asking about other states, other markets. What do you recommend for somebody who's new? I've always had the mindset of, if you're just starting out, you should be able to walk out of your primary and hit your investment property with a rock, being able to keep tabs on it. Because we do have a deal right now with an out-of-state investor, bought a property here in Florida on the Space Coast, beautiful house. It took him a year to complete a $40K rehab. So as the maturity date's coming up, I was almost shocked that this property hadn't sold yet. And so I'm diving into it, and I'm like, all right, number one, this is a $40K rehab. We should have been done months ago. And then I look at the photos, and I'm like, has this property even been rehabbed? But the investor's in the Midwest. It looks like his contractor pulled the wool over his eyes, really took advantage of him because he wasn't here to check on it. He wasn't asking the right questions. He wasn't following up. So to that point, and not saying that happens with everybody, because we know plenty of investors that buy out of state and do a great job. They're very successful. But for the new investors out there that might be watching this, not the seasoned pros, what would you recommend in terms of proximity to where you live?
If you're a new investor looking to do a fix and flip, you need to start in your market or a secondary market to your market.
You had somebody on Bigger Pockets that you basically talked to.
Yeah, I had a client, somebody I talked to on Bigger Pockets. He was a new investor wanting to buy a condo in our backyard by Disney and do a short-term rental.
Which is a good market.
Great market. I mean, listen, we're in one of the best markets. We're very fortunate to be in that I-4 corridor of Orlando to Tampa that, is just hotter than maybe anywhere in the country. So not an issue, but now you're talking about manage your short-term rental for somebody that's never done short-term rentals, that doesn't understand, a myriad of things that go on. Short-term rentals are not passive income. There's still a lot of active work. You're dealing with, multiple tenants a week. You're dealing with people that could, destroy your property. It's just a lot of headaches. So, for him, he had about $70,000-$80,000 in starting capital. And to buy a condo that he was looking at, that would have locked up all that capital into one deal.
Right.
So he would have been in that deal, and all he would be able to do to refill his sort of bank account to be able to reinvest would be to collect that short-term rental check whenever that was ready. So we sort of said, hey, he's in Southern Georgia, maybe look at your current market. And he found a deal within a week. And he pivoted his mindset of saying, listen, I'm going to do one flip or two flips inject more capital into a company, something you've been teaching for years, then buy a rental. So that way you have that assembly line of capital being re-injected all the time. So
Yep.
you're not just locking it up into a rental. So I would encourage people to start in their market. Now, if they're moving somewhere, maybe they're getting a head start, that's one thing. And if you're just a turnkey rental investor, okay, buy in another market, have a property management company if need be, buy from REI Nation, shout out Kent, that, a company that really legitimately can handle A to Z for you.
Right.
That's fine, but if you're trying to manage a flip from across the country and it's your first time, that's a recipe for disaster. And some banks will not lend to you. They're going to say, you have no experience doing this. They won't lend out of state. If you live out of state, they won't even lend if you live out of the county sometimes. So I think it's risky, and I know everybody wants to be in the Southeast, everybody wants to be in Florida, but until you've got your feet wet and really understand, have some experiential knowledge under your belt, I think it's overly risky in this market.
And to your point with the building of the assembly line, because we all know that the BRRRR strategy is a very popular strategy for real estate investing, but right now, specifically right now with where rates are, the more cash that you need to pull out, the tougher it is now to qualify for the loan that
Yes.
you're trying to refinance into. So that buy, sell, maybe buy, hold model keeps them liquid. They get a better rate because the higher the loan to value, the higher the interest rate, which is making the DSCR harder to qualify for. So yeah, to your point, it's allowing them to also get the best financing option in the event that they do need to keep it. They need to pivot to plan B. Well, I don't need to pull my cash out. I get a favorable rate. I cash flow more, all is well. But if you're not, organizing your assembly line in that fashion, or starting off with the rental where it's all tied up, or in a worst case scenario, you do need to refinance and pull the money back out, well, now you're at the highest interest rate for whatever your credit bracket is offering.
Yeah, it's just to your point, there's too many variables right now. There's lenders that are lessening the loan to value. The BRRRR works, everybody that really doesn't understand it, it only works if you're buying discounted enough on the front end. That's
Right.
the easiest way to simplify it. It's not to say it doesn't work. It works right now, but it only works if you're, again, buying at the right price. And with raising interest rates and everything that's occurring, and let's say the lenders stop letting it 75% loan to value on cash outs, which tends to be the maximum amount that most DSCR lenders will offer, if that goes to 70%, well, now the BRRRR strategy is out the window.
And I know a lot of people are using traditional financing on that end, but I don't know if it's 100% fully enacted, but I know that there was talk about moving the seasoning requirements to 12 months if you go the traditional route. So that might make it even harder, or if you are going to do that, then you're really maximizing your holding costs, which is ultimately eating into your pocket.
Yeah, it's a lot easier said than done. It
Right.
sounds great to people because they hear, "Oh, I can get all my money back out." That's
Right.
all they hear.
Right.
They don't understand the intricacies of everything. They don't understand that markets can shift in that time period where they're rehabbing it. So you really do have to be aggressive on the front end. And if you're buying from wholesalers, which a lot of people tend to do, right now they're struggling a lot. They got so comfortable off just selling to hedge funds all day with endless pockets, and when their buy box changed, all these wholesalers are scrambling to actually build a buyer's list.
Right.
Get away from all they had was an email blast list. They didn't have any relationships with buyers. They just had relationships with the REITs and hedge funds of the world that everybody else does too. That's not your friend.
And it's not the time that you want to be trying to cultivate those relationships. Hopefully you've already built that.
Yeah, 100%. So, and they still want to get their margins. So wholesale deals right now sometimes are no different than on-market retail deals, because they're still hungry to pay their staff and live on the lifestyle they had when things were good. So, BRRRR strategy, if you can do it, great, but you really have to run the back-end long-term financing numbers as you're running the short-term financing numbers at the same time and say, okay, will this really work?
Right. So we're talking about navigating risk, and it starts with identifying what the risks are, and 3 easy ways or items to focus on are condition, location, and maybe zoning, because a lot of people tend to get stuck there, or they're not doing the proper due
Well,
diligence.
if they're a short-term rental investor, like I would add in
Great point.
Legalities of where your market's moving. I
Right.
mean, does like in Orlando, for instance, you can't do short-term rentals in Orlando proper or Orange County. Now, some people do, but it's the law basically is you have to live in the property. So you can do a room rental, or maybe you have an ADU, an accessory dwelling unit, a mother-in-law suite, if you will, that you can rent out. But generally speaking, you can't. For various reasons, Disney doesn't like it. They want you to go to Disney hotels here.
Well, there's a lot of cities and counties fighting. The
Sure.
homeowners are sick of the foot traffic, so they're trying to, invoke new regulation, which would prevent you from operating that short-term or mid-term
So
rental.
for people to have that mindset of I want to get into short-term rentals, really get with, there's short-term rental, pro short-term rental lobbying groups that in your state. Do a Google search, talk to somebody at your local RIA, really understand the guidelines there. Because to your point, and I get it, I fully understand where some people are coming from, not wanting, foot traffic in their neighborhood all the time. And, in Orlando, in Kissimmee, which is, the Disney area, Osceola County, South Orlando, if you will, that area is very pro short-term rental. There's a lot of people there. It can be a saturated market, but there are communities that are specifically set up for short-term rentals. They have shared clubhouses, there's short-term rental communities. So those things are the good areas to target. But yeah, you have to understand everything that could be a pressure. And I would also go as far as saying, if you're buying in an HOA or with a condominium association, understanding their guidelines. Does an investor own 51% of the units in that condo? Well, if he does, he essentially controls the board.
Right.
Do they allow short-term rentals if you're buying a short-term rental condo?
And factoring it into your debt service numbers as well. So the next point was getting into the due diligence, which a lot of this we've covered, but staying on topic, I think analyzing financials is a big part of it, and specifically with short-term rentals. So I think a lot of lenders that say that they offer short-term rental financing are still using market rent to qualify. There are some options that we have access
Let's just clarify. When you say market rent, what do you mean?
So the average rent for an average single-family residence in that neighborhood.
But it's for a long-term
tenant.
Yeah.
Correct.
So
Long-term
not
tenant.
they're not using based on what you're grossing via Airbnb.
No. What the
Yes.
actual market calls for a long-term tenant, which is substantially lower than what the short-term rentals yield. So understanding your financials. So if they're qualifying it off of DSCR and you know that you're bringing in a lot more income, or a lot of times these short-term rentals tend to be more expensive properties, so they're harder to qualify on market rent. What are a couple of ways that they can get around that? So there are options for projected income. We also have a strategy of utilizing property managers, if you want to elaborate.
Yeah, so there would be multiple approaches. Number one, to your point, there are some programs, but you're limiting yourself on basically one or two programs that will use like AirDNA projections or sites like that. If you have an existing property in that area that is being already operated as a short-term rental, then we can use that as a comp and use their financials that are in existence to sort of project out.
Right.
You can also season it in a bridge loan for a period of time to where maybe you have 3 or 6 months of short-term rental payment history, then use that amount to show that you can roll it into long-term financing, and that lender can extrapolate out those statements and figure out an annual gross rental amount. You can also reach out to property management companies that do short-term rentals, pull 3 comps from them and get the data from them. And if we can verify they're a certified property management company, then we can use that. So there are ways around it, but you have to know somebody that you can really talk to. And a lot of banks won't touch them. You know what I mean? Some of your largest hard money lenders and DSCR lenders will not touch them. So
Right.
Working with somebody like ourselves that we kind of specialize that, being in Orlando, we have multiple channels for that. And even if you have to go the route of seasoning it in a bridge loan, if you are truly using it as a short-term rental, it should easily cover your debt service and that bridge loan, and you should be making money. Yes, you're in that higher interest-only loan for a period of time, but you're doing it as a means to an end to be able to show the empirical data that, yes, I can rent this via Airbnb, VRBO, direct booking websites. So there are multiple approaches, and some of those people, I would encourage them, depending on what the market is, if you need to go the midterm rental route, that's not a bad option. You're going to get a premium above usually a long-term tenant, your normal tenant. And in my opinion, it can be less of a headache. It's more passive. You have a nurse maybe that's living there for 3 to 6 months that cares about the house because they're living there. They're not going to destroy it because they don't want to, reflect badly upon maybe the corporation that's leasing it. So being open to midterm rentals, and I think we touched on this before, that some of these hospitals, 70% of the nursing staff is traveling nurses.
Right.
So I think midterm rental is a good alternative, and especially if you need to sort of skirt that guideline in maybe Orlando or somewhere else. That is you don't want to be at risk of being kicked off Airbnb because the city shut you down. And it's not hard for the city to find. They can go on there and say what bookings are available in Orlando. Well, I'll just go to those houses, pull the county records, and I know who's operating illegally.
And if it was previously operating as a short-term rental, then get those financials. You should
Great
be
point.
asking that question anyway,
Yeah.
and analyzing it and making sure that the deal makes sense because you have data to go off of. Now, they may not be a top-tier operator, so you might get value add on seeing where their financials were and what you can change, whether it be to the property or marketing strategies. But if it was used as a previous short-term rental and you do have that data and that data works, we can use that.
Yeah, and you're going to want to get that because they're probably telling you, hey, we have bookings for the year. You're going to be stepping into already booked properties. Now, you may cancel those bookings because you think they're underpriced or incorrect, but absolutely, if they're already operating as a short-term rental, you should 100% be asking, hey, provide me with any statements possible.
Got it. So identifying and evaluating the risk, condition, location, zoning regulations, due diligence is extremely important. Anytime you're investing money anywhere, do the proper due diligence, but specifically the surrounding area, which ties into location, analyzing the financials, whether it be income on the property or projected income, even if it is a long-term tenant, knowing what those numbers are.
Do your own pro forma. If you're not doing
100%.
your own pro forma, what do you do? You're just relying upon somebody else. So,
well, to that point, there's plenty of tools out there. There's plenty of free online calculators that you can use. We were talking about ways to analyze the data for short-term rentals. Again, a couple of them that we have written down, and I'm sure there's more. And when we post this video, people can go in there and add any additional tools that they're using to evaluate numbers. But AirDNA, PriceLab, STR Insights. Is there any other that you can think of off the top of your head?
no, I mean, listen, there's a ton. Some of them are all the same.
Right.
They're going to tell you some of the data is irrelevant. It's not going to be perfect. And that's why you should really pin your numbers down. And again, it goes back to if somebody has existing statements, look at theirs and match it up against these sites and say, oh, what's wrong or what's right here? And maybe just get as much data as possible, then filter it through as best as you can. But there's a myriad of tools out there.
And the last thing I had was just making sure that you're verifying information provided to you by sellers and brokers. And that tied into what we were talking about in terms of zoning and pulling the property card. But ask questions. Ask a lot of questions. There's never a dumb one, and that one dumb question or what you think is a dumb question might save you thousands of dollars, if not tens of thousands of dollars, when you actually get in there and start a project.
Yeah, and this is maybe just a layered on thing. At some point on some properties, if you have, like, again, going back to the example, multiple, structures on one parcel, maybe do a survey in some instances. Mm-hmm. You don't want to you want to make sure that your land, what you're buying, is really what you're buying.
Yep.
It's not necessarily, for cookie cutter neighborhoods that are, pretty newer, established, conforming.
Probably anything built after the 80s.
Yeah, those things fine. But if you're buying a large, piece of property or large piece of acreage, or just do that. Yes, it's going to cost you $400 or $500, but it's going to be worth it if you realize, hey, that's not my land, or
Right.
or I'm, my stakes or fence is not that can be costly after you close. So just make sure you're covering all bases. And there's a lot of risk in real estate, but there's a lot of reward. So just do it correctly.
Every lender, when they're analyzing a deal, I don't care if it's a flip, if it's a turnkey rental, I don't care what asset